Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this public forum of the Climate and Recovery Initiative. My name is Travis McLeod, and I'm the CEO of the Centre for Policy Development, and I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Brunswick West in Melbourne, where it's been raining for most of the past 18 hours, but it's beautifully sunny, or at least the sun is poking out as we start. And on behalf of all of us, I want to begin by paying our collective respects to the elders of the past and present of all the lands we're joining this forum from. Now, we've got an hour and three excellent speakers, stellar speakers. So I want to make sure you hear as much from them as possible and that we have some time for questions at the end. So my introduction will be very brief. In late May, the Centre for Policy Development established the Climate and Recovery Initiative with ClimateWorks Australia. It's an inside track effort to bolster alignment between COVID recovery and climate priorities and to get the best ideas into the right hands. We want Australia to win on our recovery from COVID and to win on climate at the same time. Joining CPD and ClimateWorks on the steering group have been the Australian Industry Group, the ACTU and the Pollination Group. We went public with the first set of proposals and analysis at the end of September. One of the proposals is a plan to integrate a climate risk and resilience focus within the new National Cabinet. Another is a co-investment partnership model to turbocharge private and public funding of decarbonisation strategies across jurisdictions, key sectors and supply chains. We also released specific analysis on the huge job creation potential of decarbonisation aligned stimulus measures in the areas that have been most impacted by the pandemic across Australia. Today is our first public forum. We've deliberately scheduled it for after the US presidential election. We thought holding it more than a fortnight after election day would mean there is no doubt, or there was no doubt about the outcome. Now, of course, there is no doubt about the outcome, although there's always one or two people who seem to doubt basic arithmetic. I can assure you we won't have that issue this afternoon with our three speakers, Geoff Summerhayes from APRA, Anna Skarbek from ClimateWorks and Don Russell from AustralianSuper. We've asked them to reflect on recent developments on climate change, the COVID recovery and the road ahead in 2021 as we look ahead to the International Climate Summit in Glasgow about a year from now, COP26. As many of you will know, there has been good progress in recent weeks internationally and some big announcements here in Australia as well. It's terrific to see the momentum building for faster and more ambitious climate action to pull the transition forward. We do need to get our skates on though. The latest estimates have the globe on track for a catastrophic warming trajectory, and it may already be too late to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The format for today is very straightforward. I'll ask Geoff Summerhayes to start us off shortly, followed by Anna and then Don. We'll then have a little bit of time for questions and discussion, but we'll need to finish a few minutes before 5 o'clock. Some of you have already sent in some questions, so thank you. By all means, pose additional questions on the chat as you listen to the speakers, and the team will send them across to me. You can send them direct to CPD Tech Support if you would like to as well, and we'll get to as many as we can. But let's start with APRA Executive Board Member Geoff Summerhayes, who perhaps more than anyone else connected Australia's financial regulators to the international agenda on climate risk, started by Mark Carney with Geoff's speech in February 2017. As many of you know, Geoff finishes up his term at APRA at the end of this calendar year, and I'm sure you'll all be interested in how he sees the direction of travel on climate, both here and overseas. So Geoff, over to you to get us started, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Travis, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. And as Travis mentioned, I finished my 5-year tenure as an APRA board member this Christmas. And 2020, what an extraordinary year it has been in terms of global developments and also including climate change. I'm grateful to CPD for giving me this opportunity to share some reflections on progress that have been made on addressing climate change as a financial risk. And I also wanted to outline the next steps from APRA's perspective and other regulators. Australia's financial system depends on international capital. And so this is one of the main points I want to emphasise today, is how Australia's response to climate financial risk has been and will continue to be informed by regulatory and market developments internationally. We are now better placed for this challenge, and we need to be, because we are confronting fundamental questions about our institutions' competitiveness and risk preparedness in global capital markets that will be reshaped by an accelerating pace by the impacts and responses to climate change. So to begin with, let's look back 4 years. It was new ground for an Australian financial regulator to speak publicly on climate risks when I gave APRA's first major statement on its approach to climate financial risk early in 2017. At the time, financial firms were largely unsure about the need and how to integrate systemic climate risk into core business planning, risk and investment decisions. And it's fair to say that there was some uncertainty amongst regulators about the right approach, including the right combination of carrot and sticks to support better industry response. The key message that I delivered then was that rather than being a long-term or non-financial problem, some climate risks are distinctly financial in nature, and many were foreseeable, material, and actionable then. But as I explained at the time, we weren't the only ones saying this domestically. In fact, the statements that we made were consistent with what global regulators were saying, led by Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England. APRA's considerations in 2016, when we took the decision to make some statements about climate risk, were informed by 2 global developments and 1 local: the Paris Agreement, the FSB's TCFD, and here domestically, the Hartley-Hartford-Davis opinion on directors' duties. The implications of these signals in capital markets, financial regulation, and legal cases has continued apace since. As far as climate risk, financial risk is concerned, today, Australia's financial regulators are on a unity ticket. APRA, ASIC, and the Reserve Bank have comprehensively outlined our respective approaches, responses, and expectations to climate risk. Over this period, a key priority for us, given international capital flows, has been ensuring that Australian institutions understand these global trends and are converging to what is emerging global practice on climate risk. Frankly, with climate risk upon us and system-wide impacts of climate change increasingly apparent, we were seeking to ensure that Australian institutions were not unprepared or adversely impacted by what was happening globally. APRA took the view in late 2016, ahead of our public intervention, that delaying would have made the transition risk for Australian regulated firms even sharper and more difficult to manage. In practice, this has meant mainstreaming awareness of climate risk as a financial risk for key corporate governance issues and prudential supervision, establishing a very clear focus on the hallmarks of global leading practice, including use of robust, Paris-consistent scenarios as a starting point for assessing risk. Setting clear expectations about the adoption of new global standards on climate risk governance and disclosure through the TCFD framework, and encouraging and supporting industry leadership and ownership on the issue, something that has been absolutely vital given Australia's globally connected markets and institutions. For regulators, this has also meant building our own global linkages and participation on climate risk, including through initiatives such as the UN Environment Programme Sustainable Insurance Forum, which I chair, and the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS as it's known, which involves the Reserve Bank of Australia and the bulk of its global counterparts. The US Federal Reserve has announced it will join soon. So where are we now? There has been a rapid transition in the larger firms' mindset to incorporating climate in strategy, governance, and risk management. We are seeing a significant shift towards industry ownership and leadership on climate risk. One example is the work of the industry-led Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, or ASFI, which after more than a year of deliberations will release its recommendations tomorrow. Another example is the ongoing work of groups like the Investor Group on Climate Change and other organisations such as the Bankers Association, the Insurance Council of Australia, ACTU, who collectively and individually are working to build understanding and benefit all. This event is another example where CPD and ClimateWorks have convened leaders from across the country to identify alignment opportunities between our COVID recovery and these climate priorities. In June, the NGFS described the COVID pandemic as a real-life stress test of what could be potentially experienced in an increasingly unstable climate or a disorderly transition shock, which is why the Council of Financial Regulators is conducting a Climate Vulnerability Assessment, or CVA, as part of our climate risk initiatives. We'll be working with the larger banks in Australia in 2021 to implement the CVA, building both knowledge and understanding of climate risks and opportunities for the banking sector, as well as supporting industry leadership and capability development and providing valuable insights into priority areas for further development. We expect the insights from the CVA to be valuable across all industries, and in combination with our draft prudential guidance, which we'll release in 2021, which will provide tangible guidance to support the finance sector as it continues its consideration of risk into its governance, strategy and risk management functions. Our lived experience of the bushfires last summer are also a further reminder of what climate change is going to mean for Australia. The bushfires left financial impact of over $10 billion, of which less than half of that amount was covered by insurance. 33 people dead, over 3,000 homes destroyed, and billions of animals dead or displaced. And while 2019 was the hottest year on record for Australia, as well as the driest in New South Wales, the science points to 2019 in the not too distant future is being seen as an average year. The Bushfire Royal Commission recognised the risks that more frequent and extreme weather events pose in terms of disaster resilience and has put forward a range of recommendations. In the same vein, financial regulators recognise the material risk presented by climate change for the finance sector and are acting to support industry as it addresses the risks and the opportunities where they occur. So let's look at the road to COP26 this time next year and beyond. Steps towards better management on climate financial risk are critical because the pace of change and the risk and opportunities that go with it will continue to accelerate. Even in the past few weeks, as Travis mentioned, we have seen a series of announcements from companies, investors, and trading partners. To facilitate the flow of capital globally, financial regulation tends to progressively align, and in some cases, quickly. So some recent international policy and regulatory announcements are seen as reliable market signals for the direction of travel. These include the UK announcement that climate disclosures will be mandatory for large companies and financial institutions over the next 5 years as part of its net zero commitments. Closer to home, New Zealand will also do so by 2023. The US Federal Reserve has recently published its first statement on the financial and economic implications of climate change. With all roads leading to COP26 in Glasgow next year, we can expect this dynamic environment to continue with major near and long-term implications for Australian institutions. The COVID pandemic and the global recovery and rebuilding phase before us will have a major implication for how this plays out. In many countries, Australia included, this is seen as an immense opportunity to accelerate investment, innovation in the transition that can support a strong recovery now and a more resilient climate-aligned economy in the future. The Australian Finance Minister has been making this point strongly in recent weeks. With both risk and opportunity rising, it will be critical for Australian firms to ensure that they have sufficient responses to both physical and transition risk, but also are maintaining our highly regarded financial sector's competitiveness in the emerging green economy. Thanks to steady progress on climate risk in recent years, we're approaching this juncture in a stronger position. I'm encouraged that we're up for the challenge, not just of responding to risk, but of seizing the new financial sector opportunities that will flow from this next industrial revolution to a low carbon future, which, like previous transitions, will not only require a massive investment, it'll also create a wealth of opportunities and leave a raft of stranded assets weighing on those that didn't see it coming. I'm fond of the quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Australia has led by example during the pandemic. We can be justifiably proud of our leaders at all levels and across all sectors of the community. We'll need all of that and more for the climate change challenge. It is encouraging to see the leaders convened at an event like this, collaborating and initiating. APRA and the Council of Financial Regulators will continue to play their part to support capability building, climate risk management to ensure a stable and resilient financial system for this and future generations of Australians. Thank you, Travis.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Already sparking a number of questions in the chat, which we will we'll come to shortly. But first, for a reaction and her own reflections, I want to go to Anna Skarbek, my partner in crime on the Climate and Recovery Initiative. Hi, Anna. Anna's one of the most trusted and consistent voices in the country on climate change and on decarbonisation trajectories. She's been CEO of ClimateWorks Australia for over a decade now and has served on a number of key entities during her tenure there, including as a board member for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Anna's had a busy day, most of them are. She started off this morning as one of the kick-off speakers at the AFR Energy Summit. But over to you, Anna, for your reflections on how we're tracking and the opportunity to align our COVID and climate priorities.
Thank you, Travis. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Geoff, for your insights and for you personally and your organisation, APRA's leadership on climate risk over a number of years now. You are a great illustration of what an impact a leader and an entity can have when they take a focused interest in this topic and a proactive approach to embedding it across all aspects of their own work. As you, Geoff, mentioned, we're at a really pivotal moment, and while there's a lot of more hard work to do, we're in a stronger position thanks to greater focus across regulators and industry on understanding and integrating climate risks into decision making and building climate-related capabilities. And I know many of my colleagues in the climate movement have helped support that increased understanding, and it does leave us in a much stronger position. And Travis, you noted how important this event's timing is following the US election, but also it is this week that COP26 was meant to take place but for COVID, and it has obviously now been deferred a year. And so that gives us a very clear focus, which we're discussing tonight, around the roadmap for the next 12 months with this major COP26 moment, the crescendo around net zero emissions goals and trajectories. And I know Don will speak next a little more about the global developments. And so I'll share some observations about recent progress in Australia and what the components of a pathway might be for Australia towards COP26. And in short, it stems from this position that there really is increasing convergence now on the goal of net zero emissions from governments, investors and companies, but there is still a lot of work to do to align the actions for achieving those commitments. And that's certainly where we at ClimateWorks have turned our attention now. And Geoff spoke a lot about financial regulation and disclosures, and I too will focus on investment because of its power in achieving accelerated climate action and because of the large opportunities in Australia for investment to achieve the double dividend. That is helping economic recovery from COVID and setting up Australia's economy for the future we need, a cleaner and safer one that can be prosperous too. Encouragingly, the federal government remains committed to the Paris Agreement and has recently declared that it's committed to reaching net zero emissions as soon as possible. All the states and territories have formally committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, and we know our research shows it is possible to achieve this by 2050. Nationally, there has been significant headway achieved, progress in the technology investment roadmap being published, and continued funding for ARENA, the highly successful Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which I know well, and which is now one of the world's largest green investment banks. The Tech Investment Roadmap recognises the suite of available solutions to reduce our emissions and flags that the federal government will invest in areas that were once overlooked, for example, in low carbon hydrogen, green steel, aluminium. And there's enormous potential to support large-scale investment in these technologies and send policy signals to catalyse the necessary market responses. Our research shows that Australia needs to rapidly develop and deploy the emerging zero emissions technologies in the harder to abate sectors. We used to call them harder to abate when solutions weren't known. Now they are known, but they're not yet widespread. And that extends to sectors including agriculture, transport and industry. And the proposed new mandates for ARENA and CFC can help secure that growth if it's also matched with increased funding and focus across governments to cover the broader sectors. It is indeed a whole of economy challenge. Plus, there are many mature technologies across all of the sectors in our economy that still need support to become more widespread more quickly, so that Australia's federal and all the state and territory governments can achieve their emissions reduction goals. At the state level, we have seen several ambitious announcements over recent weeks, notably New South Wales Government's electricity infrastructure roadmap recently, focusing on very large-scale volume expansion of renewable energy and storage, equivalent to a significant portion of all the wind and solar in the national electricity market already, and close to doubling what the storage potential would be right now. Certainly, this is the kind of climate-aligned recovery measure and aim at scale that can send powerful signals to markets. We also saw New South Wales focusing on investing in the green and hydrogen sector, as we have seen many state and territory governments and the federal government putting a concerted focus on hydrogen. Another big state announcement was recently this week, the Victorian government's close to $800 million investment in what's considered some of the biggest household energy efficiency package, certainly in Victoria's history, covering social housing retrofits in their thousands and minimum energy standards for rental properties and other supporting policies to replace inefficient equipment. This does have the potential to transform the building sector and is a classic example of that double dividend potential that many clean energy investments can also bring from stimulus investments to both boost the economy through new jobs and lower bills at the same time. We know industry sectors are increasingly understanding that it makes good business sense to aim for net zero, and they're making more commitments. We've seen this in the superannuation sector, and I know we'll hear more about AustralianSuper next. There have been many super funds recently commit to aligning their portfolios to net zero emissions. So have heavy industry sectors, and I was pleased today that it was announced that Fortescue, Cebus and Oricon became the latest participants to join the Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative, which is focused on net zero emissions supply chains across our major resources sectors and is co-convened by my team at ClimateWorks and ClimateKick, and involves other industry participants, including BHP, BlueScope, BP, Orica, Wesfarmers, Woodside, Australian Gas Infrastructure Group, Schneider, NAB. You can see that major industry is taking net zero emissions supply chains very seriously, and we know, as Geoff said, there's more to come from the finance sector and ASFI. But while these commitments are really important and they really do create powerful momentum, the reality is that the implementation actions by government and businesses still don't yet go far enough. There is still a new surge of investment that's needed. And so if we are to be aligned with net zero and what the Paris Agreement calls for, so we must turn now to the how rather than to the if of how this should be done. And whilst Australia might have a more challenging starting position, given the resources nature of our economy, it requires leaning into that and facing the choices now rather than delaying them, because the worldwide direction is only one way now towards decarbonisation. And we know we can't slow that down, but we could slow down our market's readiness unhelpfully. Yet we know Australia has a major opportunity to use our resource industry skills and relationships and harness the world-class renewable energy resources that we're blessed with. With China, Japan, Korea, UK, EU, and now the US wanting to fully decarbonise their economies, they will need huge volumes of zero-emission energy and resources, and Australia can be a major exporter of that zero emissions energy and resources. So with the impacts of COVID, there is now one more year before the next COP takes place next November to flesh out the details of what those long-term strategies will contain, and that is indeed the request of the next COP. And so we have looked into what might a pathway look like for Australia, and we look at this across 5 streams: securing Australia's position in a green global economy, having a strong vision for jobs and transitions in key regions, accelerating key investments, building the net zero potential for 2050 and strengthening 2030 targets. I'll touch briefly on each of those so that I know we can then have more time for discussion afterwards. It is a chance to secure Australia's position in a green global economy. This moment of climate-aligned stimulus measures and net zero commitments by major economies are creating global momentum, and there is significant economic and diplomatic upside for Australia if we can be part of this agenda. Also, the global momentum means that the vast majority of Australia's exports are going to trading partners who have now committed to transform their economies. So that will result in a shift in demand, and that demand presents extraordinary opportunities for Australia as we're rich in minerals and renewable energy resources, natural capital potential, and as one of the world's largest exporters of gas currently, we could be one of the world's largest exporters of green gas through hydrogen or ammonia made here using renewable electricity and water. So that then links to the second pillar of a strong vision for jobs and transitions in key regions. A place-based approach means that Australia can secure our place in a global green economy while also delivering more resilient local economies if we consciously ensure that fair and effective transition occurs in a place-based way. We can align COVID recovery and climate priorities to secure the jobs for today as well as for tomorrow. This could include establishing a transition planning commission or an authority to support enhanced focus on regional transition planning, and always remembering to go for the double dividend with the COVID responses, ensuring that climate opportunities can support transition and vice versa, that climate programs take account of local jobs and development opportunities. And so the third step is accelerating the investments. And Trav has mentioned the co-investment proposal that we have been working on. There really is an opportunity now to seize the moment to secure the surge of investment that the world needs. The UN scientists have declared we must halve global emissions this decade. Currently, Australia is targeting a 1/4 reduction. But we can get more bang for buck from the current investments that are planned or may come in future government budgets by helping coordinate federal and state agencies. All of our states have net zero emissions goals. We have excellent federal agencies in ARENA and the CFC, and we are working now to help those jurisdictions and agencies coordinate better to achieve bigger leverage from the private sector and a supply chain scale response. The second element of that is to be goal oriented in the way that government can catalyse whole markets and supply chains by setting goals that are at supply chain scale rather than aiming necessarily at the end user or the end equipment, but trying to catalyse the markets we know we will need if we are to serve the global economy with its huge demands for zero emissions products, services and energy. And to do that sort of backcasting, to aim for that necessary scale, draws us to the obvious focus on net zero emissions for 2050. Now, I mentioned the convergence around that goal. The task now is to resource the planning towards those goals. Actually, having the commitment requires new ways of working in sector-wide alliances. It's actually a new corporate skill as well as a new government skill. And as all the people we work with would know, it often doesn't come with a budget for that time. That the time and the humans that you need to work together in these alliances has not traditionally been allocated for. But to achieve these goals, we will need to make those allocations so that we can catalyse whole supply chains and develop new products and services that make decarbonised solutions the new normal, not an add-on that remains niche. And related to that, once you've got your 2050 goals and building pathways towards them that are actually resourced to do that work and identify the steps, then it obviously leads to the fifth and final step we talk about today, and that is strengthening 2030 targets. That's the reality of having a net zero emissions commitment that's aligned with the Paris Agreement and with the global momentum now. In climate, we talk a lot about decades and percentage targets that are a decade away. The 1.5 degree pathway requires emissions to halve this decade and the next to reach that net zero goal. So those of us that are committed to a net zero goal are by definition committed to halving emissions this decade and the next and the next. Well, so what does that mean if we're not talking about percentage trajectories that can sound quite removed from reality? It means, for example, in investment terms, 2 project finance terms or business loans that would be 5 years each. It means in car lease terms, potentially 1 or 2 or 3 car lease purchase products. In companies or departments that have 5-year corporate planning periods or a 3-year strategy, it means that the current corporate plan you are operating under needs to do enough so that the next one is bringing home the 2030 commitments, not just the goal, but the actions that will be halving emissions worldwide. Is your current corporate plan setting up that your next one finishes that job? When we look at a decade in those terms, it's not long at all. For repairing our soils or revegetation, it's 10 harvest seasons, for example, to harness our natural capital potential. Our research shows it can be done, but it requires what we call an all-in effort in terms of accelerating the investment across all of the sectors and getting that initial surge occurring so that markets have their own momentum. And I hope that all of us today can apply in our own work that thinking of breaking down the next 10 years into your corporate planning periods of 3 or 5. And certainly we're focusing on the next 1 year in this roadmap to COP. And I'm pleased that ClimateWorks is partnering with the Centre for Policy Development and the partners that Travis mentioned with AIG, ACTU, Pollination, and the state and federal governments. It has been a collaborative initiative. We do have this convergence of the will, but now we have to turn it into the able and the capacity. So I look forward to continuing this initiative into 2021 and making sure that we can harness these opportunities. And hopefully in the COVID year as well, that we can harness the huge pace of change that we've experienced and seen around rapid adjustments being possible. And whilst we might feel a little bit exhausted by COVID, I hope we also take confidence from it. We have seen ourselves change and respond. And we can do it. We can do more than what we might have thought previously was the usual pace. And thank goodness for that, because we need to go faster than the usual pace. So it's time to lean in, set the right bigger goals for all investments that would be made or co-designed in the next 12 months. Let's do it.
Thank you, Anna. Very clear on how to bridge the gap between commitments and action and how to up the ante and quicken the pace. Last, but certainly not least, I want to come to Don Russell, Chair of AustralianSuper. I should mention that Don is also a CPD board member. One reason we're particularly keen for Don to join the panel today is because he was Australia's ambassador to the United States between 1993 and 1995, just after the last one-term president, President George H.W. Bush. Don has been a fixture in Australian public policy for decades, in Treasury, as Principal Advisor to Prime Minister Keating and to Treasurer Keating, in the private sector, as a Secretary at Commonwealth and state level, and now, of course, as Chair of AustralianSuper. I'm sure you'll be interested in Don's take on their recent commitment to net zero emissions in their portfolio by 2050, and Don's view on what President-elect Biden might mean for the agenda on climate. Don, to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Trav, and thanks, Geoff and Anna. I'm very pleased to be able to offer my thoughts on all of this. I guess it's easy for us, now that we're all caught up in the circus of the transition, to forget a little bit just how important this election was. I think it's fair to say that the world was teetering on the edge of something really chaotic. Countries are path dependent, and I think it's fair to say that another 4 years of the Trump administration would have done lasting damage to US institutions, but I think it would have also set back the chances of any global cooperation on a whole range of issues, including climate, for a very long time. Knowing the US, I'm sure there are still those fearful that we will look back and we will see that Trump was the first of the mad US presidents. But for the time being, I think we should all think that the US has stepped back and has reconsidered the last 4 years and has signed up to a more orderly and rational approach to public policy making. But I think it's a mistake to see that we are sort of moving back to the Obama years, particularly around China. The US remains incredibly polarized, and notwithstanding the fact that Biden was a clear winner, Trump came very close to winning, very close indeed. And the Republican Party itself improved its position in the House. It did better in the Senate than was expected, and in state races all around the country. But I mean, the big change with the Biden administration is that there will be a strategy on climate. They will rejoin the Paris Agreement, which means that they will have a plan for COP26. But as ever, it's worth remembering that you know, regardless of who controls the Senate, the US will not be in a position and can never be in a position to enter into binding agreements. The treaty power in the Senate is overwhelming. It simply requires 60 votes. So there's no way that the US can enter into binding commitments. The world, I think, has come to understand this and can live with it, but it's always called a lot of players, participants, that the US expects other countries to make commitments where they themselves cannot. But I think it's fair that to say that it's unlikely that the Biden administration or the Democrats will control the Senate, and we're looking at a return to the last two presidents, where a lot of presidential action came through executive powers. I've been suspicious for some time that the Supreme Court will eventually curb the power of a US president to rule by fiat. I think that was all in abeyance while Trump was the president. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Supreme Court doesn't take action in the next 4 years to rein in powers that President Obama took upon himself and Trump took upon himself. So the executive authority, I suspect, may well be constrained in the next 4 years. But Biden has pledged to spend $2 trillion on clean energy, and there's nothing like dollars to form the basis of a discussion, you know, with various interests in the US. So, assuming that the Senate is of a mind to try and build a greater level of cooperation with the Democrats than has been the situation in the past, that at least provides some mechanism whereby there is scope for the Senate and the administration to coalesce around some climate change initiatives. But I think it's important to accept that China is inevitably going to play a clear role in this. She and Obama were the important drivers of the Paris COP outcome. I think it's also fair to say it wouldn't have happened without US-China cooperation. And it's hard to see COP26 being a success without US-China cooperation. I mean, it's a number of people have made this observation, and it's true. Climate is an opportunity for China and the US to find a new accommodation. But the key thing is that they both need to want to. It will be a familiar world with the Biden administration, in the sense that the US will be looking to work with allies, but they will be calling out human rights abuses in China and the rights of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and China will find this particularly difficult and awkward. So it may well take more discord before China and the US are willing to cooperate. So I think, collectively, we should look forward and plan assiduously for COP26, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to be totally disappointed and devastated if COP26 doesn't prove to deliver the results that we're looking for. Many have observed that China thinks in terms of centuries, possibly millennia. 1 year may well just have to go through to the keeper before they're willing to engage with the Americans. But having said all of that, I think there are extraordinary opportunities around COP26. It's good to remember COP25. Started off in Brazil, meandered through Chile, ended up in Spain, and most people have forgotten about it. So there will be more structure, just simply because the Americans will have a plan, and the world, at the very least, will have to adjust to that. But it will be very dangerous for Australia in this sort of environment to be viewed as a free rider on global efforts to reduce emissions. A number of people have observed that the EU is actively considering border carbon taxes to target countries who are not pulling their weight. And many have observed that similar ideas are being floated in the US, and particularly around Biden himself. I've always thought it's dangerous when US Nobel laureates like William Norhaus advocating tariffs on non-participants in global actions like climate change. And Australia will not want to be seen to be actively opposing the US in the run-up to COP26, so we will be in a tricky position where we will need to trim our policy so we're not voting against the US. And fortunately, there are parallels between our technology roadmap and the US and their $2 trillion. But it's going to be particularly dangerous for Australia to be flirting with such things as carryover credits. That puts us in very bad company, with a whole stack of other deadbeat countries at a time when the world will be wanting to lift global standards. So I think it would be very much in Australia's interest to draw a line under carryover credits and sign up with the rest of the right-thinking members of the world community. AustralianSuper, we have the board, just last meeting last month, we have committed to a AustralianSuper portfolio which will be carbon neutral by 2050. It's important to realise that the fund does always act in the best interests of members, and that our commitment around carbon neutral by 2050 comes very much from an active role of incorporating climate risk into the investment decision. So this is not a solution that we've imposed on the portfolio. It's what comes out of a long-term view about the importance of climate risk in the long-term returns of our members. And the other important thing is that we are on track to achieving a carbon neutral portfolio by 2050. And I guess of potentially even greater interest is that we are on track for a 45% reduction from the 2010 portfolio by 2030. So I think it is a powerful point that AustralianSuper, acting in the best interests of the members and explicitly taking account of climate risk, as a long-term investor, we have come to the position that for the best interest of the members, we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. So as a long-term investor, we have a very strong interest in being able to understand how companies are managing climate risk, making sure that companies are actively engaged in their long-term strategic management of their companies around climate risk. We're very interested in companies developing a capacity to outline scenarios around various different views of the world. And I guess going back to Geoff right at the beginning, the whole TCFD notion and the whole notion that directors and business have to discharging their responsibilities, have to take account of all of this as they go about running their companies. Maybe I'll leave it at that and happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Don and Anna and Geoff. I want to get straight to questions because I want to make sure that as many of the questions posed in the chat can be answered. And I might pose a question to each of you first based on those questions and then take those in turn. And if it's possible, Geoff, Anna and Don, just very short, sharp responses so we can get through as many as possible. So Geoff, the question for you is going to be about sticks. Charlotte Grieve from the SMH&H asked this on the chat: how often does APRA use its stick to encourage better climate risk reporting? And you, of course, in your remarks, talked about when you started this process, you thought about the combination of carrots and sticks, and other regulators have started using more of the sticks than the carrots. So your view on whether we need more sticks. Anna, some questions in the chat around the political and economic significance of carbon extractive industries, fossil fuel industries, including from Harry and Hans. We saw in the initial phase of the recovery a lot of talk about gas. Do you think we're past that old growth model? Do you think that's sunk in, the imperative to move beyond it? And what do you think is the most exciting opportunity to really accelerate that bridging of the gap between commitments and action as you described it? And Don, I'll come to you and Geoff on the significance of the McVeigh litigation. And Don, a question that's just been posed by Michael Slezak from the ABC, the significance or otherwise of comments by the regulators in recent years on climate, both here and abroad, the Hutley opinion and recent court cases on climate to AustralianSuper's decision to set that target around net zero. So Geoff, first to you for the question around sticks.
Thanks, Trav. So our focus in 17 and 18 was absolutely on building awareness and drawing the link between climate risk, physical transition liability risk back to existing prudential standards. So when you look at our existing prudential standards, binding, legally enforceable standards, all firms are required to have a risk framework and address those risks in a proportion to their size and complexity of their operations. So we focused on mapping the risks back to those firms. We've now shifted to greater action on that. So we are asking firms to evidence to us that they are actually doing that in their strategy, risk management and governance. Metrics and targets are a little more challenging because we are all, not only here in Australia, but grappling with taxonomy and appropriate measurement standards to have market comparable disclosures. But we saw, Trav, a shift in firms over these last 3 or 4 years, a market shift, particularly in the larger, more sophisticated firms.
Thank you, Geoff. And it's been mentioned on the chat, but I should just note the comments made by the US Federal Reserve 2 weeks ago on its financial stability update, particularly the statement made by Governor Lael Brainard, who is one of the tips to be the Treasury Secretary. But in her statement, she said it's vitally important to move from the recognition that climate change poses significant financial stability risks to the stage where the quantitative implications of those risks are appropriately assessed and addressed. And I think we've seen that move to mandatory reporting in a number of Australia's big trading partners. Anna, to the question to you, if that's okay.
Thanks. Yes, you asked me what's the most exciting development at the moment around, if you like, big industry and big investment, and can we do it? Some of the tone of the questions is, can we actually do this? And I think for me, the moment is indeed the confluence of this moment. So the investment need, the scale is in the trillions worldwide, and we've long known that. But right now we're in an investment moment worldwide where interest rates are at record lows. Governments are trying to stimulate economies, and money can move faster than policy. We've seen policy is complicated. It doesn't mean it's not needed. But what we've also seen is that when investment is goal-oriented and co-designed by government, it can bring forward a lot of that industry and technology progress. So, for example, we've seen the costs tumbling even in the last 5 years. Even though we might have lost time in terms of policy, we've gained time, if you like, in the rapid development of technologies that have had deployment support. So worldwide, the Mission Innovation Program set a goal for global cooling, you know, air conditioning for India, can costs fall by 80%? And they actually didn't know if it could be done, but they set a competition, an investment competition, and they're now on a path to achieve it. Similarly, the UK wanted to stimulate the UK offshore wind market, recognising a range of strategic developments, and it had its own depleting oil fields and it needed a renewable source and it didn't have as much sunshine or land. So they went offshore before it was cost effective. I remember over a decade ago working on that. They've been now doing reverse auctions, again, letting the market do the discovery of what the price should be and promising that each next round will be lower. And costs have fallen 75%, which is more than any author of the program ever predicted. So what excites me is that we have this moment where there's money wanting to go into economies and the clean technologies are largely a capital investment up front with zero cost of fuel if it's renewables, not always zero operational cost, of course. So if we set ambitious goals, I'm hopeful that we can see outperformance again and allow technology to go faster.
Excellent, thanks Anna. Don, to you now. So there's two questions here, one from Michael Slezak at the ABC about the significance of the comments by APRA, by Geoff, the legal opinion and various cases that are preceding the REST case being one of them, to AustralianSuper's decision making. And the other question that's come from Miriam Lyons, you obviously work and talk to a lot of companies who have pledged to decarbonise. What do they need from government in the short and medium term in order to be able to get on with the job and get clarity on those pathways?
Well, I guess in terms of how we've always viewed the portfolio, I mean, as I said, we've always adopted the view that we have to act in the best interest of the members. What's really, I guess, focused AustralianSuper's attention in recent years has been the conscious decision to bring in-house much of the investment function. Most of the Australian equities is now managed in-house. So if you're actually making the decision yourself, whether you invest in company A or company B, you actually have to form a view about the outlook for both of these companies or all the companies you invest in. And we're a long-term investor. We're not interested in what the price of the stock or the value of the company will be tomorrow. We have people who will be with us for 10, 20, 30 years. So issues about stranded assets or about how businesses are planning to deal with a world which could be quite different from what it is today is of enormous importance to us. So I think we have always looked very closely at climate risk. So and for that reason, we've always been able to work very closely with regulators around that proposition. Are you taking account of climate risk? And the answer is yes, we have to, because it's an integrated part of the investment decision. We'd be totally remiss if we were investing for 10 years if you weren't thinking about what the world would be like in 10 years' time. With the legal opinions, I think, as I was saying, I think we've always seen what the regulators are doing as a way of assisting, what our task, because it's made it much more powerful when we engage with companies around that very proposition. What are you doing? What strategies do you have in place? If we can point to a regulatory framework which is encouraging companies to be more forthcoming to shareholders and stakeholders about their plans, we can have a much more productive conversation, with a company if we know that the regulators are on the back of the company also talking about you need to, identify climate risks. So I think with that, it's very much a virtuous circle. So we have welcomed everything that the regulators have been doing because it makes our job easier. And I think we've been able to work very constructively with the regulators to make sure, or to satisfy them, that we are acting in the best interest of members and not ignoring an important potential detriment to future earnings of the fund.
Thanks, Don. And Geoff, I might throw to you on that one, because the original question, the first one, I think came from Michael about that recent case of McVeigh and Rest, even though it didn't result in a judgment and was settled. Does it make concrete some of the responsibilities that you've pointed to, and also, John Price from ASIC and Guy Bell from the RBA, even the RBA's financial stability update last October pointed the significance of that work. What's your comment on that litigation and the prospect of more sort of litigious or enforcement action?
Well, it's exactly what Hutley predicted, and it's triggered by Paris TCFD and regulatory and policy matters globally, which are reliable market signals, which therefore catalyse a risk. And that risk is that directors need to understand the implications of climate risks to the decisions that they're making, in this case, an investment portfolio. But Trav, I think it's much broader than just what regulators are saying. This has been driven by markets and market decisions on this, by consumers, by customers, a customer in the case that you refer to, by activist groups, and of course by the courts. And so there's really nowhere to hide on this risk, because the risk is now mainstream. It's not some fringe ESG consideration. It is a mainstream financial risk that is materialising and in firms here and around the world, and directors need to be on top of it.
Well, thank you. And we've got about a minute, so I think we're going to have to wrap up. That's probably a nice note on which to finish, the notion of mainstreaming awareness around this and bringing forward the transition, which is something that the Bank of England have been saying consistently, I think, since Governor Carney's intervention 5 years ago. I think what was a clear theme of all the remarks was the fact that there have been some terrific commitments and an escalation of ambition around the world and in Australia, but there's a hell of a lot of work to do. And as Anna skillfully pointed out, there aren't that many investment cycles, political cycles, business cycles between now and 2030 and certainly 2050. And it's really all ahead of us, both in Australia and across the world. I want to thank our speakers for their insights and their expertise. And I want to thank all of you for joining and for all the questions and comments and materials that have been shared through the thread. Rest assured we've captured that and we'll take it forward. Given one of the reasons for having this forum was to give Geoff a chance to reflect on his tenure at APRA and also to offer some thoughts on next steps, I do want to, as Anna did, offer a special thanks to him for his leadership on this issue in his term at APRA. His speech in 2017 and his speeches since have been a real catalyst for that unity that has been spoken about, that unity of effort between Australia's financial regulators, really lifting our sights and accelerating that convergence with your peers around the world. So thank you, Geoff. We want to acknowledge that contribution. And ahead of this forum, I was in touch with Dave Jones, who served as California's Insurance Commissioner from 2011 to 2019 and was your predecessor on the International Sustainable Insurance Forum, that network of insurance supervisors and regulators, a bit like the equivalent of the network of central banks for greening the financial system. Dave couldn't join the forum given the time difference, but he did send a note about your contribution, and I just want to quote from it. He said, Geoff has made an extraordinary contribution to the work of financial regulators generally and insurance regulators in particular through his leadership of the CIF, which has advanced supervisory best practices relating to addressing climate risks to insurers and insurance markets. His joint leadership of the CIF and the International Association of Insurance Supervisors has resulted in important collaboration between those two organisations and broader recognition and action within the insurance regulatory community and with insurers of the critical importance of identifying, analysing, disclosing and addressing climate risks. I've got no doubt, Geoff, that passion will continue once your APRA role finishes, and that the CFR with Guy, DeBell and others is well placed to continue that agenda forward. With that, thank you to you, to Anna, to Don. To everyone, stay safe and take care, and we'll be in touch very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks all.